Hello, my name is Daniel Serrato. I'm the Executive Director of the Miami Design Preservation League, and we produce the annual Art Deco Weekend. And we also help manage this center on behalf of the city of Miami Beach. We give our walking tours, we do advocacy, and it's all part of our mission to preserve, protect, and promote, which is more important now than ever with some recent state legislation that could impact the ability of coastal communities around the state of Florida from protecting our historic buildings. So if you think of the state of Florida without its coastal heritage, there isn't really much history left. And so we want to make sure that we sound the alarm and also educate ourselves about how we can become more resilient to deal with the challenges of today and tomorrow. So we were really excited when we had our call for speakers. We had the application from Dominique and Jen. And Dominique is a founding principal of the Preservation Design Partnership. And she completed one of two individuals who completed dual masters in architecture and historic preservation at the University of Pennsylvania. She also apprenticed in Mid-Atlantic and in New Jersey with historic preservation, and she started her organization, Preservation Design Partnership, as a planning and design practice focusing on services for clients throughout the country. But specifically of interest is the work in New Orleans with the 19 historic districts, and also design guidelines for flood mitigation in Maryland, and elevation guidelines in New Jersey. So very interesting stuff that we're not yet doing in Miami Beach and Florida as much, but I think there's a lot that we can learn. And then we also are lucky to have with us traveling from up north, Jenny Bull, who is an AICP preservation planning specialist with the Preservation Design Partnership, and was most recently historic preservation officer in St. Augustine. And also, to add to that illustrious list, the prior president of the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. They are a statewide advocacy group. And when we were in Tallahassee last year, the Florida Trust, led by Jenny and Melissa and others, really helped us navigate the hallways of Tallahassee, which is no small task. So we are really lucky to have both of them here visiting, and please join me in welcoming them. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction and for all of you for sticking it out to the end. If you want to readjust to be able to see the bottom, go to the bottom of the slide, you might want to relocate. If you can see it, fine, that's great. So this presentation, Jenny and I are both going to be sharing the presentation. We have shared the work. And we both get equal credit. But I also want to say, if you have questions along the way, feel free to interrupt us. We're happy to answer them because we don't want to lose anyone in this process. So we're going to be talking about some technical things related to FEMA and how they regulate, as well as hopefully providing you with good guidance and tools on a community-wide basis, as well as for individual properties. Just a show of hands, who's here representing a community, a HARB or a commission, or somebody in sort of local politics who's trying to help communities save buildings? Not really? A few? Okay. Mostly homeowners, property owners, or people who are interested? Okay. I'm trying to balance the time to make sure we cover what's interesting. So I'm going to turn it over to Jenny to talk about Florida historic resources and flood threat.
Thank you very much, Dominique, and thank you so much, Daniel, for that wonderful introduction. And I do also want to give a special thanks to MDPL for being great hosts to us, being not only from out of the state, but way on another side of the state. So we've had a great time this weekend getting to see more of the Art Deco district. So what we want to focus on a lot in our presentation today is relating historic preservation to flood mitigation, to resiliency efforts, and saying, why does historic preservation matter in that context? And if we start looking back in time, which is what we as preservationists love to do, we can say that it's just been an inherent part of the process all along. In Florida, we know that the land mass and the water bodies have changed significantly over time, and you can see that in the archaeological evidence. So that also provides us some scientific data of previous cultures and how other people used to deal with these climate change events. So one of the communities that's specific to that and has special place in my heart is St. Augustine. And I like to share this as a relevant story to help make this connection, because just in the 10 years that I was there with the city, we really discovered a lot of those connections in the archaeological record of flood mitigation, but also things that we wouldn't have discovered if not for mitigation, whether it's mitigation for public utility projects or for demolition projects. So if there is a purpose to having a design review board in place, to having local ordinances that say, all right, maybe things are going to change, but we're going to manage that change and do a certain way. So in St. Augustine, and I'm going to try to scoot out of the image here, they changed places over time. So at the first spot was the landing spot where Menendez encamped for a few years, and eventually a mission site was developed there. And then later on, when they decided to kind of go separate from the Indians, the Seminole, they moved across to Anastasia Island at settlement number 2, which has not yet been concretely founded, but we know it's over there somewhere. And then finally down at the bottom of the screen is where modern St. Augustine is. But where they settled in St. Augustine, their primary city, is on a ridge. That's where the oldest houses are in St. Augustine. They're not on the waterfront. Things that were on the waterfront, some things like churches and a burial ground that extended towards the water. And when they were doing archaeological investigations, they found the 1572 cemetery that lied underneath buildings and in between streets. And interesting, one of the folks that was buried there was determined to be a 14-year-old African boy. So they knew at that time that came over with Menendez that there were Africans in St. Augustine in America at that time. But one of the other things that they discovered was a flood wall. They could see the sediment pattern changes, and they could see the evidence of post holes and walls that had been built to shore up against the water coming up into the city further and disturbing these burial grounds historically. Another example that's a little more recent is Egmont Key in Florida. And you can see up here on the top screen, the outlines of the island have changed over time. And so this is a community where we can see it happening just between 1877 to 1976 and to today, how it's shrunk and how it's been affected by erosion, whether it's boat traffic, whether it's wave action of other sorts, but it's been slowly shrinking. And it's also one of those examples of how historic preservation can be used to inform how to adapt and mitigate. Because this island is a very special place to the Seminole Indian. It has an unfortunate history. They were held captive there for several years during the Seminole Wars, and they have an active role in what preservation activities go on through that because of some federal regulations, which we'll talk more about later. But it is a significant way to ensure that future decisions made for this island do take into account existing and diverse cultural resources. Even more recently, I know a lot happens around here and everywhere in the building demolitions are going on, and also building elevations are going on. And in St. Augustine, they do have an archaeological preservation ordinance, but also do have a historic review board that mandates certain activities occur if you're going to be disturbing the ground. So what resulted as a building elevation was the discovery of old coquina stone foundations. So you can see the yellow or the light colored material. Those would be coquina stone, a very historic material that was carved out of the quarries on Anastasia Island. And then you can also see the more modern historic brick foundations. And so no one had known that those were there and wouldn't have known if they had just elevated the building, gutted out those foundations, and moved on. So we were able to learn more information about how houses were settled up along the riverfront during that time in St. Augustine. So another aspect that's important to consider is just thinking about how historic resources are they make dollars and cents in terms of being assets. So sometimes we have to just talk about it in economic factors. And in Florida, you can see how much historic resources are distributed across the state, but also mainly concentrated along coastal areas. So we know a lot of communities established historically near the water and near agricultural resources that they could thrive with. And so these resources are still there, sometimes under the ground, but a lot of times, as in all of these National Register sites, they're above ground and still visible and still worth protecting and evaluating for future development changes. And that amounts to about 2,000 National Register sites, over 200,000 buildings or structures that have been recorded on the state master site file, which is just an inventory, 38,000 archaeological sites, and there are 53 Main Street communities. So in the previous presentation, I'm not sure if anyone attended that one, but we started talking about Florida Main Streets and how they're an economic driver and how there's a tax credit coming along, hopefully this year, to help spur some compatible renewal of Florida's historic Main Street communities. But essentially the message is that historic assets because they can be economic drivers, and it's not just tourism, but it's also the value of properties, taxable properties, about jobs and so many resources that mean a lot to so many people. And if we don't have these resources, we're just going to be suffering a great loss, in addition to dealing with flooding and storms. So there are certain things that we can do that are practical, and definitely things that local communities can adopt in their policies. And so some of the things that we wanted to share is how you can become part of that advocacy network. If you help yourself become informed about some of the language and the policy barriers that are out there, and you can help support positive things of how resiliency and historic preservation can go hand in hand. And some of these things we looked at as Preservation Design Partnership, we looked at across the state in more detail, which we'll speak to shortly. But we discovered that there are some commonalities across the state and some resources that can be put together to help us all realize what tools are in the toolbox. So we just want to work to share this together and understand that it's important to keep preservation in mind for many reasons. So we start looking at the dollars and cents more specifically. And for those of you in the back, I'm going to try to call out one of these economic impacts of Florida Main Street just between 2017 and 2021. We could see the comparison between Florida and outside Florida. So jobs in Florida, there are almost 2,000 jobs in Florida because of Florida Main Street programs versus 781 jobs in compatible areas outside of Florida. Income is 90,000 compared to 48,000. GDP is 144,000 compared to 78,000. And these are just looking at Florida's Main Street communities and the economic impact that they contribute. Obviously, there's other ways to look at economic impacts, but that was just one aspect that we looked at. And we have a model for telling us how to mitigate and how to deal with historic resources and mitigation projects. There's federal legislation that says you must do these certain activities if you're getting federal funds or a federal permit. This is a seawall that was redone in 2011 to still preserve the 1843 seawall in St. Augustine, which was made of granite and coquina. But the idea is that there is this model that the federal government has put out and requires it, and the state does have similar legislation, but it's gently, I would say, applied. If things don't get into our state historic preservation office for review, there may not be anything that they can do about it. So a part of our job is to also make sure that the Florida State Historic Preservation Officer is at the table. So we were fortunate enough to take on a project that was a statewide project across Florida with the help of the Florida Division of Historical Resources and the National Park Service at the helm as they were funding and directing this project. But we were able to go around and look at what are the common resources, the common challenges that a lot of Florida communities were facing in terms of flood mitigation. And from that was the basis point of this whole project that we're sharing with you today, so that we could then develop recommendations. It wasn't, well, we know what the solution is. Dominique has done work in, 2 other statewide projects. Certainly she has an idea of things that could be done to help Florida's communities, but we recognize that Florida is very unique. Florida is very special in many ways. So it's important for us to go visit communities that were your average places, your small communities, your inner cities like LaBelle, even down here, and Leesburg up here, but also Jacksonville and Apalachicola and Everglades City. So we looked for a wide range of communities to try to understand what the issues were. And that way we could consolidate it into a guide that would help other communities be able to say, hey, this community is doing this thing with their building code that helps them to deal with flooding. Well, why don't we take a look at that? And are they a comparable community in terms of size or income or what types of resources they have? So that was the main goal of our project. We're going to go into that in more detail as we move forward. And I think at this point is where I'm handing it back over. No, I'm not. Okay. You'll see we'll get into a tag team a little bit more, but we have done this presentation a few times, but it's different for this circumstance because, as I was saying, we're really trying to help share and motivate you all to participate in the process. There's a lot of things that your local governments can do in terms of dealing with flood mitigation that's not, quote, historic preservation. And the more that you can put in a zoning ordinance, the better, because then historic preservation isn't the bad guy, so to speak. Everyone has a zoning ordinance, so that's just the rule of the land. But there are certain things you can do in the zoning and building code and floodplain regulations that will inform how properties can be mitigated. Something like, where do you want to measure height on a building? Do you measure it from base flood? Do you measure it from the crown of the road? Where is that point? And we found that it was at many different places across the state. So we made some recommendations on how to address that. But obviously, importantly, you need a lot of incentives for rehabilitation. We've talked about a potential state tax credit. There already is a federal tax credit. At the local level, a lot of communities in Florida take advantage of a property tax incentive, and that can be done for flood mitigation projects, more than likely. I know in St. Augustine, following Hurricane Matthew, the city specifically said, yes, you can use the property tax exemption program to elevate your building. Those will count as improvements because it's going to go on your tax assessor. They're going to recognize it as an improvement, so the city should as well. But there may be other benefits and programs that would work in your particular community. Other tools that are out there, again, fortunate to say that St. Augustine could be a good case study in trying to develop what those are. It's still probably a challenge of getting them implemented, but what we find, at least the best thing to do, is putting out information and allowing communities and individuals to have access to those resources so they can decide what's best for them. An archaeology program I've already mentioned, and also an economic assessment analysis, I think, is something, if you can't motivate your commissioners or leaders in any other way, find a way to do an economic analysis that can correlate how flood impacts and flood events will affect your commerce, will affect your jobs, and will affect your property owners. Pardon me. So I think closing out in advocacy section, it's all about empowerment. And it's empowering with knowledge. I'm kind of repeating myself at this point, but in order to have the knowledge, we took on in this project a goal to write in simple language and use very detailed and but obvious graphics that can help tell the story so that some of this complex language, like flood mitigation, the National Flood Insurance Program, what's a substantially damaged structure, all these things that your building code officials are going to speak to you in as property owners or managers. You need to understand what that is and understand that in historic preservation, there are options and flexibility as well as opportunities to work to do something that's very compatible. And so there's three basic steps that we're going to go through, and that's decoding the regulatory framework and developing sensitive design methods, as well as participating in the emergency management cycle. And so those are three takeaways that we hope that you will carry with you as you go forward and become advocates for resiliency and historic preservation. Oh, yes.
So thank you. So Jenny has mentioned a project that we both worked on a couple of times, and I think in all fairness, we need to tell you what it is. So we were contracted by the state of Florida to actually develop guides for the property owners, communities, and the state to help address the regulatory challenges of these two groups of people who don't speak the same language and nobody knows what anybody's talking about. So we were trying to put everything in very simple English to explain to property owners, what can you do? What can you be empowered to do? To communities to say, what are the tools in your tool chest? What other use can you adopt to help protect your community? For state governments, how can you get the Florida Department of Transportation to talk to the Historic Preservation Office to make sure that they don't let everything out? So that was the project. So decoding the framework, all of the flood regulations are really based upon flood maps. You can go online to FEMA's Map Service Center and literally download flood maps for your street address. So for your home, for your community, for your city hall, for your church, whatever the building is. And it will tell you about the level of flood vulnerability. These flood maps also established those properties required to have flood insurance under the National Flood Insurance Program. Is one of the available sources, and it also impacts how communities will regulate flooding. So understanding how to move these maps is really important. I'm not going to get into the lingo here today, but this is what one looks like. Give you an idea of what the color coding is at the basics. The blue is what is known as the special Florida hazard area. It used to be known as the 100 of flood, which is no longer applied because 100-year floods we all know are happening more than every 100 years. So it's the special flood hazard area. The brown color, beige color, is the 500-year flood or 0.2% flood, which means in any given year it has a 0.2% chance of flooding. Not that it's going to flood every 500 years. Yes, ma'am.
Are there multiple models? What's the flood projections, like the extreme model?
So the regulatory model is all based upon FEMA's mapping system. In addition to that, there are communities adopt higher standards. So at minimum, you must meet the state standards in terms of how high a building has to be above this flood line for it to be considered flood-proofed. Many communities actually have higher standards than that, so you have to be even higher than that. So part of the language challenging is understanding what your local community requires, and that's your floodplain manager, who may also be your building inspector, is the one who can tell you what that number is. Okay?
Well, I just wonder, FEMA, they don't know with 100% accuracy, right?
Okay. So now
sea level rise. Yeah.
I don't want to spend the whole time talking about this, but let me just give you the quick answer. These maps are based upon everything that's happened before. They do not project forward.
Got it.
So these are all based on historical data, and people get a false sense of security on this map. If you live here, it doesn't mean you're not going to be flooded. There's no magic line on the ground that's going to say the water's not coming. So that's the way to approach these maps. So they're generally topography maps. Okay. Yes, sir.
What about water that comes from below?
So Florida is built on very porous ground. So water is going to come from below. So seawalls, like you saw in St. Augustine, are fabulous unless you create a bathtub by building a wall and have the water come up. That's the nature of the soil in Florida, or the ground in Florida, is that it's porous limestone. So that's also a flood risk.
That's not depicted on there.
I'm sorry?
That's not depicted on these maps.
That is not depicted on this map. That's true. And the other source of flooding that is not depicted on this map is when your stormwater system overflows. Or the pipe bursts in front of your house, right? That's also not depicted on this map. This is only based upon the potential for flooding based upon waterway proximity and height of ground relative to that. Okay? So there is something that you can get to say, well, where am I relative to this magic line that I can't, that's on the map, right? How high am I? And it's called an elevation certificate. So you can actually commission an architect or an engineer or a land survey to give you one of these documents. What this does is it really gives you a true sense of your level of threat. If you were doing a major renovation to your house or building a new house, this is a required piece of paper. One of the problems is that historic buildings were usually built closer to the ground. But as a historic homeowner, you are not required under the federal or the state regulations to actually make your house safe. You're not required. Local governments may have a different answer, but federal and state do not require it. And those buildings were built what's called pre-firm, before the firm map. The map I showed you is a firm map, so before the firm map were actually enacted. So some property owners, including this one, actually saw the variance so they didn't have to raise their house to meet the requirements. So let's be careful about what that means. The variance means you don't have to spend the money to raise your house, but it's not removing the threat. So the threat's there, it could flood. This property owner made a decision. I described the special flood hazard area. If you look at, the resources that are within the special flood hazard area, there are a lot of historic resources, as Jenny pointed out, that tend to be located. All of the words, so I'm going to start speaking some of these code words because they are the words that the flood administrator in the municipality will use. And part of the challenge with historic preservation and flooding is preservationists do not speak FEMA flood talk. You have to learn their words because they're the only words that matter when you have those conversations. So, base flood elevation. So where that blue line was on the map is what's known as the base flood. That's the line of the special flood hazard area. So base flood elevation is where the water, according to FEMA's past history, is going to rise in that 1% flood chance. Then there's something called design flood. So design flood is the level to which your local community tells you have to build to be safe. Generally 1 to 2 feet for residents above base flood. Okay, does that make sense? The difference between the base flood and the design flood is something called freeboard. And that's the understanding that we all intrinsically know there's sea level rise and subsidence and things happening where if I build a house today, 30 years from now, I'll be less safe. So I'm building in a factor of safety. And the other thing to say, where you measure these lines to is depending on whether or not you are on the water and you have waves coming in, or you're inland. It floods inland as well. So if you are on the water, it's known as a V zone, velocity waves. So in a V zone, your distance to measure is to the bottom of the structure. So the waves have plenty of clearance to go under. If you're in an A zone, it's to the top of the floor structure, the first floor structure. So those are all sort of the key codes in FEMA language in terms of how to have the conversation. So then there's also something called substantial damage and substantial improvement. So if you are in the unfortunate circumstance of having a building that is severely damaged as a result of a storm. Oh, is that not working? Can I take this thing off? Yeah.
Sorry, it's going in and out.
Okay. Oh, I'm just going to do that. So if you were in the unfortunate circumstance of being damaged in a severe storm, if the cost of the damage exceeds 50% of the value of your house, not the land, but the building, then you are required to make it fully compliant to meet current flood codes, which will mean that you might have to elevate. If you decide to improve your house in a major way, you finally put that kitchen addition you've always wanted on the back, and you improve it more than 50% of the value of your current structure, you also have to do that. And again, there are nuances in changes of rules depending on your municipality. That's why it's important to talk to your floodplain administrator. There's also a compliance review piece of this. So generally if you're in a local historic district, whatever you're going to do is going to go before your local board or commission. There may also be a requirement to go to the state historic preservation officer if you are getting any money from the state, i.e. from the tax credit program Jenny described, or if you're getting money from FEMA to elevate your house. So the state eventually will need to sign off on an elevation. There are certain demolition, review, and mitigation requirements that are also going to be required. And again, this is a conversation with your local building code official. So when you are thinking about the various regulatory tools, there are a few different things to think about in terms of how you make choices about how you're going to mitigate. So sometimes you're required to mitigate. Sometimes you can want to mitigate. You can even just want to mitigate to reduce your flood insurance cost, but you have to balance that out against what your property can take and how much change is going to be acceptable to you. So think about the level of vulnerability, the type of building it is. You can lift any building, is what I can tell you as an architect. Engineering wise, you can do it, but sometimes it will not make sense to do it. If you're in a group of buildings like a commercial strip where it's all row houses with party walls, you could lift that too, but you need everybody to agree. The different types, I'm going to tell you some different types of things, some less costly to do and some that will be more costly. And I'm trying to be very cognizant of your time, so I'm going to speak like a northerner. Apologies in advance. One of the best things you can do is to actually maintain your building. A building that is sound will withstand a flood a lot better, or a hurricane. So taking care of your building on a regular basis is really important. Wet flood proofing is another one of these options, and it can be both for residential or for commercial buildings where one option is literally lift the floor of the building. And here's actually a great photograph of a warehouse building where they were able to raise the floor because they had sufficient ceiling height above. So you can do things that don't impact the outside of the building and create a safe place. One of the other things that you may have seen, and historically this existed, but the newer versions aren't so pretty, so we don't photograph them as often, is these vents under houses. That's a way for the water to go in and out at the bottom of the house without creating pressure on the walls. So allow the water to travel in and out with that groundwater that's coming up, as well as the water from the outside, and balance it so that architecturally you're not getting pressure and compression on the walls that will cause them to collapse. There's also something that's called dry proofing, and the idea is to wrap your building in saran wrap and keep all the water out. That's the essence of the idea. So in this case, these folks were constantly flooded, and their historic preservation office let them brick in the bottoms of the windows to keep the water from coming in every time the water rose, because it would literally, they'd get flooded out every 6 months. You can also do something like put a dam in a storefront. So you've probably seen them, the sort of metal panels that you can insert, but you can do it in a way that's sensitive and be able to protect the interior from floodwater coming in. But anytime you have this kind of a situation where you're having dams or other things, you need somebody to be there to install it, who knows how to install it properly, access to it, and is not as worried about, and can also get home and take care of their own family, right? So that's a real big balance. Here's an example that's beautiful. This is another version of a dam. It just happens to be their front door, but this is actually a floodgate to here. So there are different ways to design them in a way that's sensitive. So one of the biggest problems everyone has is with building elevation. And I always get the question of how high can you elevate? Well, my answer, my question back is always going to be, where's the flood level? Because if you're going to bother to elevate, you should at least elevate to be safe. Right? So if you take the same house, so to speak, running down a hill and your water is here, house on the left is fine. Second house is a little iffy. Third house has got some issues. Fourth house has real problems. So the height of the elevation is going to vary based upon where that water line is relative to the ground. And most people, you could do it sensitively, but most people, once they start elevating, want to get that extra garage space in, a little storage, a little this,
And they go elevating very high.
and doing things like putting garage doors on the front so they get the parking and what have you, and it can dramatically alter a neighborhood. So it's something to think about as to whether or not, the value of the space versus, the character of the neighborhood. And this is, again, zoning can play into this because you can prohibit garage doors at the front, you can prohibit curb cuts, you can do a lot of things to protect the neighborhood without necessarily, flat out saying you can't have parking. The other thing you can do is say that you can only elevate your house to a certain number of feet above wherever that base flood elevation is. So if you're locked into the number, then that's fine. So here's an example of a building elevation. This house was elevated to that. They also rehabbed it completely. I apologize for the slide. So the row house example where everybody had to agree, this is a commercial strip that was elevated. And what they did was they bermed it up, secondary sidewalk, and they put parking in the rear so that people could come in and around. It is possible to do it and have commercial buildings and meet ADA requirements so that people can access the building from a wheelchair. We also looked at, okay, if somebody wants to elevate a house and in traditional architectural, Florida architecture, how can you do it sensitively? So we took a number of different style houses and did sketches and said, okay, we're going to elevate 2.5 feet off the ground. This one was about 4.5 feet, and that was 7 feet off the ground. And make it very tight to the street, which means that you have to get all the stairs and all the other stuff in to make it work. But how can you make it work in a way that the essential character of the building is maintained? These aren't perfect examples, but it shows that creativity can go a long way. And now we'll go speaking here.
Yes.
Here, return.
All right. So one of the things that I think as preservationists that I myself had to cross over that wall of saying, you know what, I really need to participate in the emergency management program at the local level. And this came after inspiration following a citywide historic preservation master plan that had one chapter talking about disaster management and how to deal with that. And that was also done by Dominique before I joined the firm. But as the client, it gave me the impetus to say, you know what, I can walk into that room, and if nobody's asking me to be there, well, it's a public meeting. I'm a city official, and what can I do to contribute? And they are very welcoming in my particular community. And I'm speaking of your local hazard mitigation plan. And the reason why it's important to get involved in that is because at the back of that section is where they list all kinds of projects. And anyone that's a part of that group can suggest projects, and they will get ranked. And then if there's federal funding, they're going to start going through that project list. And with historic preservation, you can do things like you all have the Buoyant City Historic District guidelines in Miami Beach. That's something that potentially could be paid for out of FEMA's hazard mitigation program funding. So there's a reason to get involved, and there's also adaptation studies, as well as looking at ways to build in some of this mitigation language into your comprehensive plans, into your zoning ordinances. But you have to know some of the things that are going on in your community, like what is the level of flood vulnerability, what is your existing framework, what will it allow, but most important, I would say, degree of community support is at the bottom of this list. It should have been at the top, because that really is the most important thing. Because if you look at if you know what the level of tolerance is for change in your community, not just related to architectural change, but flood mitigation type changes, those are the types of options you can start going for first when you're getting involved in these meetings. Some of the simple things that can be done is creating an expedited review process. Some communities will learn this after the fact, after they've had a Hurricane Matthew incident and they realize they need to get some roof permits out there more quickly. But that can be put into place beforehand instead of going through these in-depth policy and legislative cycles locally. You want to identify your preservation partners because those are the ones that are going to help you understand that if you bring in a bunch of dehumidifiers and fans into your home or into your business property, there is a way to dry out the building, and you can they will help you understand what the materials are. Because plaster isn't the same as drywall. Plaster is more cementitious, and maybe it can be saved by just drying it out. Maybe it's not going to mold. So those are some options that you can be looking at if you have a team, say university students, faculty, or other experts in your community. Even the Florida Trust does, after every hurricane, assembles a hazard support team. And we will look out into our resources and contact community members and say, well, what are your biggest challenges? Do you need an architect to come out and get some initial ideas? Do you need some people to help do your disaster damage assessments? What kinds of things can you do? And one of the other important things, speaking to knowing what your building materials are, is getting a debris management plan of sorts. Emergency management professionals look at that in terms of, if you think of Fort Myers, I saw the debris piles for on and on and on that were huge. We're talking about, in this case, something for historic resources, so not everything goes into that trash bin. Because some things, number one, can be repaired and reused. But also, if this property owner is not going to use it, maybe it'll work somewhere else. I mean, salvage companies preservationists love salvage companies, so they can go somewhere. Also, developing information for your property owners is something really key and can also get your community rating score. There's a number that if your community is participating in the National Flood Insurance Program community rating system, you have a code of 1 through 10, and 10 is the worst, where you get no discounts. 1 is the best, where if you have a lower score, property owners in your community can get a reduced flood insurance policy. And developing information for property owners, even if it's tailored to historic properties, can help lower that score. Now I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk about our fabulous project that we've been waiting to show you.
So this is the result of our work, which was about a 1.5 year long project. So these are the 3 guides I discussed. We are desperately hoping that the state publishes them. They've had them in review for a little while. So all the information that we just showed and much, much more, it's about 800 pages of information is out there and ready to launch.
Per audience. It's per audience.
Yeah, and this is all developed per audience. So it's the state, the local governments, and then one specifically for property owners. It's about 200 pages long. So it has all of this information, including some of the drawings and sort of detailed explanations of all the FEMA stuff and how you can make improvements to your own property. So if you know anyone at the state, I encourage you to let them know that you're anxious to receive it. And with that, we're open to any questions. Yes, I saw that hand first.
I'm from out of state, and I went to visit the flag area at the Falls Springs. And the docent said that Mr. Flagler and his wife baked the house when they were there. They used heat to keep it dry and preserved. Can you use heat?
Well, heat will prohibit mold growth. So I'll make, speaking as an architect, if you keep the heat constant high, it decreases the humidity in the building and it may be less prone to mold growth.
Dry out flood damage.
So you have to be very careful with heat drying out a flood damaged property. You can't blast it with heat and dehumidification really fast because all the materials will shrink and warp. And crack, like plaster or crack. So you have to do it really methodically, which is why it's one of those things you can only do with information. And having the information out before the flood is much better than somebody trying to scramble to get it after the fact. Sir, I saw your hand in the back.
Oh, yes, I think I may have missed it, but do you have a sense of when they're going to publish this and what state agency website they're publishing on?
So it would be coming through DHR, the Division of Historical Resources. I can only say that the draft is dated April 2023. Oh. That's all I can say. It's right there. April 2023. No, we're very proud of this project, and we feel like there's a lot of information. We are approaching hurricane season, and I'm hoping it ends up being available for this season.
So this may be really unpopular to ask this question, and I thank you for your remarks. But when I looked at that map of the island and a chunk, are there historic sites that can't be moved? They can't be mitigated.
So I will give you my personal opinion on this as a northern carpetbagger. I don't have to live in Florida. So the reality is, okay, I'll make it more personal. So I have a house on the eastern shore of Maryland, and they're losing islands regularly, in the Chesapeake Bay. Their islands are literally disappearing. You cannot save everything. You cannot move everything. And I think intrinsically we have a responsibility to decide how we're going to protect the memory of what the place was, the people who lived there, and the communities that existed, because the physical fabric is going to be gone. That is my personal opinion. So, but that's, that's larger than this talk. That's a cocktail conversation. Anyone else? Yes.
Living in the UK, so this is just fascinating to hear about not being local. A bit of a bigger kind of wider question. Do you think, like in the state of Florida and the US, the issue of climate change in general now is widely accepted as yes, it's really happening? And is the government or local governments and all boards proactive about your response to that? What's the general kind of why is what I'm trying to.
So I know in UK you get a lot of US politics. So I will say that it depends on where you are. When I started doing this work in 2015, there was a, not my problem kind of attitude. I will say it's ramping up in terms of people understanding it. And it's not just coastal communities, because a lot of inland communities, rivers and streams are flooding, as well as these what's called rain bombs in some places where it just downpours an incredible amount. So it's a lot more personal to people than it was even 10 years ago. So I think there's a general acceptance by many that it's getting worse. I think there's a reluctance by another number, I don't know if it's more or less, that what are these people talking about?
Can I add one thing?
Sure.
I would just add that Florida's real estate market is just out of this world. And so you have a lot of, I know local governments that are afraid to really say, we need to abandon a certain area because all of a sudden that may affect property value. And it just keeps going up. And as long as the values keep going up, I think that is working against, as far as an economic factor, it's working against the ability of communities and the state that change more. And that's maybe giving some credit, but.
Oh, and also making it worse is all these people moving in from other places have no idea what they're moving into, and they're totally unprepared for the impacts of a storm.
So in comparison to the UK, hurricane threats, very low, and so lots of kind of extreme scenarios. We used to cycle suddenly some training brains, deal with those factors and causes. It gets published.
I hope it gets published too. We're officially no longer talking about it until it gets published. You guys are a lost dog. Yeah.
In the meantime, so it gets published, do you have any recommendations to visit any things?
So I've written a few versions. This is by far the most comprehensive thing we have tackled. And it deals with archaeology, economics, the case studies. It provides an incredible wealth of information, which is why I'm so frustrated. Yeah. But an abbreviated version of this can be found on the New Jersey Historic Preservation website.
Okay.
And it really talks about, and keep in mind, it's federal laws are where you want to concentrate, and then go to Florida, and then go to local government. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then are there any sort of, this is not a question to you, it's the only model, but
maybe just all like the meetings that you can discuss with other people like in your city, because I think as a homeowner, like that's something that is hard to find. Like sure you could talk to your neighbors, some of your neighbors don't even live in the state.
Right.
But just trying to discuss with other people around you to get other ideas, other points of view. Well, there is a national group called Keeping History Above Water. Mm-hmm. They're based out of Newport, Rhode Island, and they have a lot of good information, and they have some of their past lectures and things online. So that's a good forum starting place. I don't know specifically to Florida. Do you know anything?
There are a lot of water keepers, keepers of St. John's River, keepers of, and you name it, river, water management associations. They tend to be more involved, but it's more from an environmental standpoint. I would be remiss if I didn't say the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation, just because it's something we're going to be following the legislature on really closely. But the person in your local government that might be a best place to start with is your resiliency officer, if you're fortunate enough to have one, or your stormwater utility department, because those are usually the folks that are on the front end of developing community-wide projects that can do something about that, and they can really oftentimes point you in the direction of what's going on in your community.
You do. Thank you.
Yeah.
No, yes.
They're the ones. Here.
Yes. Who are you suggesting, ma'am? Just so everyone.
Miami Waterkeeper.
Miami Waterkeeper. Very good.
This lady over here had a question.
Yes.
Thank you. So I've attended many seminars and regarding sea level rise. But they always talk about is retreat and not to build so close to the coastline. And yet, if we look around in our neighborhoods, there's nothing but development and building on the coastline, and they do get closer to the ocean. So my question is, has there been studies about the correlation between development and flooding? Because we've seen more localized flooding since the increase in development. And I also have a question regarding the bathtub theory, because I feel that contributes to the local flooding in the areas that are not part of the bathtub. If you can elaborate on any of that.
The short answer is yes to both. So as you get increased development, not only are you building a building, you're building roads, driveways, swimming pools, and all these things that don't absorb water. So the water is the same amount, and if it has less places to be absorbed, it will just go up, right? And then it starts to impact neighbors. The seawalls and hardening of the edges of our landscape say don't put the water, water don't come here. The water's got to go somewhere, so it just goes around, which means that the person your neighbor who is unprotected, or the community who's next door, will not benefit from that, and their situation will get worse. And part of the problem with flooding is flooding doesn't know the boundary on the map. It doesn't know a political boundary. So what it does is it seeks out where it wants to be. And there's not enough communication, in my opinion, between adjacent communities to do a holistic solution at a county level so that we're protecting all equally. And that's again, an opinion.
I think Ellicott City, I want to say that Ellicott City, after their flood, started looking at how development was impacting and worsening their flooding potential.
So when I was working in Maryland, or just after, it was while I was working there, the town of Ellicott City, Maryland, which is an inland river community, there was more development upstream. And so the river ran through their main street. It was a small river. But the more development upstream, they got one of these intense rainfalls, and they had a 500-year flood go through their town, and it ripped apart some buildings. So they fixed it up. 2 years later, they had another 500-year flood go through this town. So again, it's not every 500 years. It's a 2% chance every year. So in thinking about their future, they recognize they can't impact development upstream, different county, different municipality, different whatever. So what they chose to do is selectively remove buildings from their historic district, creating a path for the water to go to save the rest. So it's a really interesting piece. So somebody actually died in one of the two storms. I don't recall which one. So it's a serious business. So I have a plane to catch. Last question.
This is a hyperloop question. So we're in a historic building. This building is not going to be here in 50 years, probably. Any idea what building that's there?
Any
Any
idea
idea what's going on with this historic area we're in right now?
What's going on with it?
in terms of flood mitigation?
Yeah.
Well, I won't speak specifically to this
Yeah.
historic district, but Miami Beach is doing something unusual currently in the country that has been done before. I don't remember what area it was.
It was near Little Haiti.
No, Miami Beach. So they're starting to literally raise streets and sidewalks. Sunset Harbor.
Yeah, Sunset.
Sunset Harbor area.
Over here, yeah, that's one.
So they're raising the streets and sidewalks above the height of the building with the hope that the buildings will come up afterwards. It sounds crazy. They did it in Galveston, Texas, and they went up as much as I think it was 12 to 13 feet in 1901. So that's what is currently underway.
Chicago raised a whole city historically.
Yeah.
So who knows?
Yeah. So it's not an easy question. We're not going to solve it, but hopefully this opened your eyes to what is possible and what you need to think about. So thank you all for your time.